Joe mentioned, I grew up in the Prospect community, which is just outside Pembroke, Lumberton, North Carolina. I tell people it's about an hour south of Fayetteville, North Carolina. Also, I like to mention, if you know where, a lot of people know where south of the border is at on I-95 as you drive up. I grew up about 15 minutes on the North Carolina side of where south of the border is. So I'm going to just share my screen. As Joe mentioned, I've given this talk a couple of times before, so it was actually kind of low. There wasn't a whole lot of work. I had to review some things and update a couple of things. But I've given this talk a couple times at a couple of other locations. So let me make sure. I've got a video in here that I'm going to I'll share at 1.2. So hopefully the audio works. I've got the also share audio tab on too. And then let me go into presentation mode. Let me slide my notes down. Okay, is that coming through okay for everyone? Okay, great. All righty. Let me say before I get started too that, it's always awkward, I guess. I don't know if that's the right word, tough. Like when you feel like you're speaking for an entire people, it's hard. So I just like to give the caveat that this is just my experience and where I grew up at. I probably didn't have the typical, whatever that means. I didn't have the typical upbringing maybe of the sort of average Lumbee person, again, whatever that means. So I try not to get too deep into that because I'm just sort of telling my story. Now, a lot of what I'm telling you is going to be factual stuff. In fact, the majority of it is just sort of, at least the first half of this is going to be just historical stuff. So, but I'll be sprinkling in my personal experience as we go. So, all righty. So that I've titled this talk "The Only Land I Know." This is actually the title of a book by Adolph Dial, Dr. Adolph Dial. He was a professor at University of North Carolina at Pembroke way back when, 1940s and 50s, I guess. He's actually my great uncle. I think he was on my mom's side, but he wrote sort of the one of the first books on the Lumbee people. He was Adolph Dahl was he was a historian, and he was a history professor at UNC Pembroke, and he wrote one of the first books on the Lumbee people called "The Only Land I Know." So that's sort of why I use that title for the talk. Okay, so let's talk about place first. So generally when we talk about the Lumbee people, we're talking about southeastern North Carolina. I like to say in the armpit of North Carolina. So down again, North Carolina, South Carolina border. In the counties you see here, the largest there is Robeson County. That's where the majority of Lumbee people live, and sort of the center of activity. And then also Hoke and Scotland County are highlighted here. So that's sort of the core of where most Lumbee folks live. So let's jump into history. Some of the first recorded, first recordings of native people in southeastern North Carolina really go back as far as the 14 and 1500s, but the sort of formal, written history is the best place to start is in the 1700s. So we're going to go 1700s sort of all the way up through current day. So we'll start. So let's start in the 1700s. So the Sherall and Tuscarora tribes were first documented living in southwest Virginia, and then later on the PD River in South Carolina. Again, that's just on the South Carolina side of or close to the North Carolina, South Carolina borders to the south. The Drowning Creek area first identified along the Lumber River and Robeson County. So you'll hear a lot about the Lumber River sort of snakes through southeastern North Carolina and Robeson County. And that's really, at least that everything I've heard about the origin of the word Lumbee is that the Lumber River was a lot of native people called the Lumber River the Lumbee River, and so that's sort of where that that name comes from. Lumbee surnames first appear in the 1790s census. So names like Locklear, Chavis, Oxenine, Hammonds are listed on the 1790 census of Robeson County, and they're listed as all other free persons. So not listed as black or white as far as race goes, but again, this sort of general term of other free persons. And then also in 1587, I'll mention this, a second colony was founded in Roanoke. And so some of you may have heard the story of the lost colony before. One of the theories of the lost colony is that the Lumbee people were associated with those folks. I won't. I could spend quite a bit of time telling the story of the lost colony, but I'll just you can Google that to learn more. But essentially, these were some of the first settlers that came in. They were on the coast of Virginia, and if you look at the roster of names of those first settlers that were part of the lost colony, some of the same Lumbee surnames are some of those same names of folks that were part of those colony of folks. Now, again, as the story goes, there was a war. This was a British colony, I think. There was a war during that time, so they lost contact with the colony for about two years. When they finally did make it back to the coast of Virginia, the colony was completely gone. No bodies were found, but they found the word Croatan etched on a post there, and they took that to mean that possibly this group of people joined up with the Croatan Indians that inhabited that area. And then 200 or 300 years later, you have this group of people who identify themselves as Native American. They have some of the same last names like Locklear, Oxendine, that were on those lists of names that were associated with the lost colony. You know, these people also have green eyes. They have hair on their face. So some folks theorize that part of the origins of the Lumbee are the lost colony. Okay, let's fast forward to the 1800s. So 1864 to 1874, Henry Berry Lowry, legendary Lumbee outlaw and folk hero, led a guerrilla war against violent and oppressive Confederate officials and later U.S. military officials, often known as the Lumbee Robin Hood. The idea was he sort of stole from rich or wealthy white people and gave food and funds and other things to the Lumbee people. I'm going to show you a picture of him on the next slide, but I want you to imagine in your head, when you hear Indian outlaw, think you've probably got an image of you in your head of what that's going to look like. So kind of hold that in your mind for a bit. 1885, Croatan Normal School was established in Pembroke. Indian leaders in the North Carolina General Assembly established a Croatan Indian Normal School, which eventually grew to become what is today University of North Carolina at Pembroke. And then also 1890s, multiple petitions for state and federal recognition were made. We'll talk more about the federal recognition efforts in upcoming slides. So this is a picture of Henry Berry Lowry. So, you know, I mentioned that he's an Indian outlaw folk hero, and so this is probably not what you had in mind when you were thinking about what an Indian outlaw looks like. So that's part of what I want to do with this talk, is sort of challenge some of your assumptions about what Native Americans, maybe who Native Americans are and what they look like. And I've got some great pictures at the end of various folks within the tribe. But I think the Lumbee, you know, people often put Native people sort of in the same bucket, but you know, tribes are they're sort of autonomous groups of people. They have their own traditions and ways, and often from one tribe to the next, there's not any more necessarily any association between those folks, between those tribes, as there are with, you know, white folks or black folks or other groups. All right, 1900 to 1953. So 1911, North Carolina General Assembly changed the name of the tribe to Indians of Robeson County. 1952, 1953 is the first sort of formal recognition of the name Lumbee as the tribal name. So Lumbee leaders, in 1952, Lumbee leaders held a community referendum to get approval of tribal members to formally change the name to the Lumbee Tribe. And then 1953, the North Carolina General Assembly changes the name from Indians of Robeson County to the Lumbee. And then also I've got a note here that numerous studies were conducted sort of in this time frame by the U.S. government and the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And these are, you may have heard of some of this research before. These were there was a sort of a set of there was some thinking at the time that you could actually do things like measure the length of someone's nose and measure the width of their forehead and things like that to actually determine whether they were Native American or not. So, and, part of this all plays into this idea of federal recognition. And again, this will be an ongoing theme as I move through these slides, the efforts of the tribe to be federally recognized by the federal government. So this was just sort of one phase of that. Now, this this way of trying to determine someone's heritage or who they are by measuring physical features and things like that, is sort of on the ash heap of history at this point. But like other tribes, Lumbee sort of went through the same thing during that time. All right, 1956 to 1970. 1956, U.S. Congress passes the Lumbee Act, which provides federal recognition for the tribe as Lumbee, and then here's the sort of kicker, but they're denied federal Indian services to members of the Lumbee tribe. So the Lumbee, and I don't know of another tribe that's in this state where we're in this weird state where we've been federally recognized by the government, but without benefits of federally recognized tribes. And that's really been the state. This was 1956. That's really been the state of the tribe for the last 70 years or more, that we're in this state where, okay, yeah, you're federally recognized, but without benefits. And again, I'll talk more about that as we go on. 1968, the LRDA is formed. LRDA stands for Lumbee Regional Development Association. This is a nonprofit group basically organized to improve the quality of life of Indian people in Robeson, Hoke, and Scotland counties. The LRDA does things. I'll talk about Lumbee Homecoming later on. That's a big event that happens around the 4th of July each year. So they help organize that. There's various powwows they have during the year. They also do things like housing assistance. There's a tribal housing authority that just does things like, if someone's heat is out in their home, they provide funds and work to restore heat. And then I think that we have a housing. Part of what they do is actually build houses for folks in need too. I think it's also a vehicle for what state and federal funding we do get, although we're not formally recognized. We don't get funds that way. There often are state and federal funds that the tribe receives, and a lot of that goes through LRDA, and they manage those funds and how they're distributed and spent. And then I've got a note here too that 1958, the Ku Klux Klan visits Robeson County. So after the Klan threatened Lumbee tribal members, Lumbee Indians used force of arms to rout the Ku Klux Klan in a confrontation near Maxton, North Carolina. The Lumbee tribe received national and international news media attention for its defense of the community against these outside hate groups. And this is more of a cultural sort of touchstone point than anything else. I grew up hearing about this. This was sort of a legendary thing. My parents were probably, I think they were in college at the time. They were in their early 20s, and it was this sort of whole thing that the Klan. It was sort of known weeks in advance that the Klan had a rally planned in Robeson County, and the Indian folks got together and basically said, not in our backyard, right? And so it was a big, they showed up with guns. This particular rally happened at night, so they had like generators and floodlights set up. A bunch of Indian folks showed up with shotguns, rifles, shot the lights out. So sort of a scuffle ensued. So again, sort of a big deal. Life magazine had an article on this whole event, and this image you see on the image you see on the right there of these two Indian folks that are wrapped in the flag. This scuffle ensued. They basically ran the Klan off the property that they were on, but these folks actually captured this Klan flag, and this is one of the famous pictures that's in the Life magazine. But it was, you talked to a lot of the older folks who were living during that time and were even at that. It was sort of a big deal at the time. Okay, 1970 to present. So 1974. Let's see, 1974, the Lumbee Act is amended, though, and again, this is this effort for federal recognition, but even though it's amended, still denied, or at least full services are denied. 1980, the LRDA creates tribal enrollment. So up to this point, and then 1980 is not that long ago. There was no formal roster of tribal members in place. So again, 1980 LRDA prepared, updated, and maintains a list of all enrolled members of the Lumbee Tribe. At this point, there are over 55,000 members. And then let's see, 1988 bill introduced in U.S. Senate and House of Representatives for full recognition of the Lumbee, but this bill actually died in the Senate. And then 2001 first tribal council elected. And again, these are things that most when we think of formal federally recognized tribes, they all sort of have this structure in place. So really just in the last 25 years, things like having a role of having a list of enrolled members and actually having a tribal council in place have just been established. All righty, so that's sort of the history piece. I'll pause now and see, Joe, any historical questions that are worth addressing?
There's no questions yet. I don't know if anyone has any, but.
And I say I'm not a historian, so I mean a lot of this is sort of my own, my own understanding of history, in addition to just the research that I've done and the reading that I've done. So I'm not, and I mean you could teach an entire semester course on a lot of the history around the Lumbee, but certainly if you have questions you're curious about, feel free to ask. Okay, let's talk about education, and as the subtitle, I've sort of got our savior here because it's sort of I think it's an important part of the culture and who we are. So again, I talked about Croatan normal schools. So there was an 1875 amendment to the state constitution that brought about segregated schools in a triracial county such as Robeson County. This biracial law did not address the needs of Native people. So I'll talk about Preston Locklear here in a bit, but Preston, along with other community members, as segregation sort of started to take place, Indian folks didn't fit in white schools. They didn't fit in black schools, so they felt like they needed a place for kids to be educated in Robeson County. So Croatan Normal School was sort of the result of those efforts. Again, this was a formal request that was made at the state level to actually create a school. Now, we're not talking about a whole school system here, right? 1887. This is really just this was a single school where just a handful of kids went. But again, it was the seed that was planted for, again, what would later become UNC Pembroke. And again, I'll talk more about that. And this is just a plaque that's sort of on the wall. This is right around the corner from where I grew up from, maybe a mile and a half from my house. In fact, on that location now, there's a church, Hope Gospel Chapels in that location now, where the original Indian normal school, the Croatan Normal School, was located. UNC Pembroke. So UNC Pembroke again began as Croatan Normal School, became a 4-year institution in 1939, and then became a part of the UNC system in 1972. And both my parents were school teachers, and both of them were UNC Pembroke graduates. Now it was called. In fact, UNC Pembroke is when it went through a few name changes in the past. It was again Croatan Normal School is what it started out as. It was a 2-year teaching school, I think, in probably the 1950s and 60s. And again, this is just for folks who wanted to teach school. That there was a 2-year program for them. Again, became a 4-year institution later, and then again is what's current day UNC Pembroke now. And these are just a couple of pictures, historical pictures that I've found that are just sort of fun to share. This building is called Old Main. Old Main is still on the campus today and is sort of the center. Present day, it's actually a Native American museum for the Lumbee people, but again started out as actual classroom space. This is from the 1940s, I think. I mean, the other thing too is again thinking about challenging what your idea of Native American is. If you look at these, other than folks that might be brown skinned with dark hair, this could be any college anywhere in the United States, right? This is Pembroke State. And again, when I was growing up and my parents went, it was called Pembroke State University. And then this is sort of current day. Again, this same building, Old Main is what that's called. And I think it's the Native American Resource Center is actually the formal name for the building. And there's there's a museum inside the building in addition to, I think there's a department, the Native American Resource Department. And I think you can get a degree. I think you can get a bachelor's degree in Native American studies there. Okay, let's talk about religion. Can't really talk about the Lumbee people without talking about religion. So predominantly Methodist and Baptist. Lumbee gospel singing is a big deal. I mean, I've talked with folks. I'll probably share some stories about me. And I joined the Army. I went in the Army right out of high school and spent 4 years before coming back and then getting my degree at UNC Pembroke. But I've traveled around to all kinds of places. And when I mentioned that I'm Lumbee, especially going to church, if I'm going to church in different places, folks will mention Lumbee gospel singing is a thing that they've heard of or seen. Notable exception is Preston Gospel Chapel. That's actually the church that I grew up in. And that's a non-denominational church in the Prospect community. So this is Preston Locklear. He's my either great or great. I always forget if it's 2 or 3 greats. Grandfather. He lived 1939 to 1916. As I said, he was one of the folks that was integral in getting the Croatan Normal School started, and then I think was also one of the first board members for what was Pembroke State University. Again, grew up in the Prospect community and a Prospect community leader. And I just like to share this picture. This is Preston Gospel Chapel, the church, back in the 1950s. Let me see. I've got a date here. This is 1953. This picture was taken by UNC Pembroke Special Collections and Archives. There's an individual named Elmer W. Hunt, and for about the span of 15 20 years, he went around Robeson County and did various communities and just took pictures of life during that time. This is one of the pictures he took. And then I'm going to focus, the next slide I've got is going to sort of focus on the upper right-hand corner. And so these are my people. You can see my grandfather there, grandmother, and then that's my dad all the way in the back there. I show this because, place, when you talk about, when you talk to Lumbee people, place is important and people are important. And there's sort of an old joke among Lumbee people that when a Lumbee first meets another Lumbee, one of the first things that they'll ask is, who's your people? And for us, that place is sort of who people are. You'll ask who your people are, and if they'll tell you, they might tell you who your dad or your mom is, or who their sisters and brothers are. And number one, that gives them a sense of place, because the community, there are a bunch of different communities around Robeson County. So depending on where those people grew up at, the place is going to be important. And again, who their relatives are is important too. And then this is sort of present day gospel, present day Preston Gospel Chapel. All right, let's talk about food. Can't talk about Lumbees without talking about food. Food history, historically a farming community. Tobacco and cotton were cash crops through the 1990s. And then the best way to describe the food is probably equal parts Indian, Southern, and American. Food characteristics, usually lots of veggies. Lumbees never saw a carb that they didn't like, so plenty of veggies, but also plenty of grease too. Predominantly pork, followed by beef. And then I've just got a note about muscadine sweet wine here too. And in fact, my family owns a muscadine sweet winery, about a mile from where I grew up from. This is the infamous collard sandwich. This has sort of only become, people ask about this, and we didn't grow up with collard sandwiches. We grew up, I will say, if you see the cornbread here, so what you're looking at, in case you don't know here, is those are, obviously there's collards in the middle there. And then this is sort of sandwich. The sandwich bread here is cornbread, and Lumbees traditionally eat this sort of thin cornbread. I know I'm here in the mountains now. I married a mountain girl, and the cornbread here is usually thick, and it's almost a cake. It almost has a sort of soft cake consistency to it. That's not how that's not what their cornbread looks like. Theirs is usually thin, like you see it here, corn-based, cornmeal based, and then it's fried. You fry it in like a black iron skillet, and then you've got fat back there on the top. And this has really only become popular in the last, I would say, 10 years ago or so. Is the first time I heard of a collard sandwich before. I will say we grew up eating, when we would eat collards and cornbread like this, you would often pull a piece of cornbread off and sort of sandwich, you sort of sandwich the cornbread over the collards and then sort of eat that as one bite. So I guess this is a convenient way to kind of wrap all those things into one sandwich. But I'll be talking about Lumbee Homecoming here soon. But certainly, if you come to Lumbee Homecoming, you'll have the opportunity to enjoy a collard sandwich. Okay, so let's talk about place, and then I've got place and dialect here too. So again, located in southeastern North Carolina. If you've never been around this area, or even the northern part, PD State Park is down that way on the South Carolina side of Robeson County, and this is generally the waters. I mentioned the Lumber River. These are usually sort of dark iced tea colored waters, and the area is generally surrounded by swamps. And part of the theory is how the Lumbee kind of came to exist was the area. The area was relatively isolated by the swamps. It was also a way for, I think that there's a mixture of, when we talk about the people that are there, not just Native American, but also it was known as a place for runaway slaves too. So there's African American blood that's sort of been mixed in there too. So during the Civil War, Robeson County would be a great place to hide, right? If you were running from, if you were a runaway slave and you were trying to escape that, Robeson County is a great place to hide. So again, I think the swamps are sort of all part of that. And also just a note here that there's no reservation lands. Obviously, generally when we talk about Native American people, you talk about reservations. The Lumbee people, Robeson County, have never had any sort of reservations. Number one, we're not federally recognized, so we didn't have that relationship with the federal government such that there would be any kind of designated lands like that. Number two, folks were either sharecroppers, and they sharecropped for, they sharecrop for usually white landowners, or folks own their own land. Again, I mentioned Preston Locklear. He acquired a huge swath of land in the Prospect community where I grew up at, and then that land was passed down to kids, and then like myself too. So again, no reservations. Folks either sharecropped or they own their own land. All right, let's talk about Lumbee dialect. So I'm going to play this, and then if you all can't hear this, let me know. Yell or wave. Laura, I'll watch you. If you can't hear it, let me know.
Lumbee English may have been influenced by a number of different groups, beginning with the very first English-speaking colonists in the area. The earliest English colonists landed on the Outer Banks in the late 1500s. Scholars once speculated that the Lumbee were descendants of the Lost Colony, the group of English settlers who vanished from Roanoke Island around 1587.
There's no doubt about it. There are a lot of similarities between Outer Banks English and Lumbee English. For example, the pronunciation of words like tide as toid, you can hear among older people in Prospect, and you can also hear on the Outer Banks. Also, words like mamek and toten are found in both places. And then you hear grammatical constructions such as I weren't there in the Outer Banks and also in Lumbee English. But it's a stretch to say that this proves that there's a connection between Lumbee English and Lost Colony English. What is probably more likely is the fact that there was an earlier English that, because of isolation, fueled the English that developed in the Outer Banks and Lumbee English as well.
While the English colonies gradually migrated inland, the movement of Scottish settlers up the Cape Fear River and into the Robeson County area was another likely influence on the development of Lumbee English. A third possible influence came from Scots-Irish settlers who migrated south down the Appalachian mountain range and east into the Piedmont. From these diverse sources of English, the Lumbee carved out the unique dialect that today is strongly associated with Lumbee culture.
And a farming, big farms, 15 acres of tobacco. Well, I couldn't get no help much from the tobacco I quit it. And I got mad to sold my little allotment off of my little farm, and I went down the street.
Language is very important. As I talked to the reporter the other day, she said, well, why is language so important? Why does this need to be protected? I said, well, that's how we recognize who we are. Not only by looking at someone, we notice who we are by our language. You recognize someone is from Spain because they speak Spanish, or from France because they speak French. I said, and that's how we recognize Lumbees. If we're anywhere in the country and hear ourselves speak, we know exactly who we are.
It's like an immediate identification mechanism. Can I talk to this person? Can I trust this person? Do we share common experiences? Do we have a common bond?
Even if it's somebody that's been away for years, there's something that lingers about their language that if he talks long enough, you pick it up.
Lumbee English distinguishes itself through vocabulary, pronunciation, and
So I'll go ahead and pause there, and I'll tell there's a story I always like to tell when I hear this. Is absolutely true. There's something when folks from Robeson County, if you're from there, if you spend enough time there, my wife, she's not, again, she's a mountain girl, but she's, we've been married for 20 years now. So she sort of knows it when she hears it, but there is 100% a Lumbee dialect. The story I like to tell is, I mentioned I joined the Army right out of high school. So I was 17, 18 years old, and I was stationed at Fort Sam Houston in San Antonio, Texas. And we were doing a parade. There was some parade kind of activity event we were doing. There's a whole bunch of folks. There were probably 200 or 300 soldiers out on a parade field, and it was a hurry up and wait kind of thing where we all had to gather there, but we were waiting for instruction. So everybody's just sort of shooting the breeze, talking, and I'm talking with a group of folks, and I heard someone behind me. It was a woman. Someone behind me was talking. She talked, and just something just like cut through me when I heard her talk. I was like, man, that sounds familiar. And at the time, it didn't even register like she's Lumbee or anything like that. I was like, man, that's a familiar voice. So I turn around and look, and in the military, obviously, you've got a name tag that has your last name there, and Bullard was the last name on her name tag, and Bullard is a Lumbee surname. And I looked at her name tag, and I looked at her, and she was kind of dark skinned and looked like she could be from home. But I said, "Where are you from?" And she says, Red Springs, North Carolina. And Red Springs is just it's in Robeson County, the northern part of Robeson County, just where I grew up from. So anyway, that's a story. And in fact, I just had another experience a couple of months ago where I was in a gym working out, and I heard a guy. He was talking, and I looked at him, and he looked like, similar to what this guy said. You look at folks, and you sort of wonder, man, I wonder if they could be from Robeson County, that they could be Lumbee. But when I heard him talk, now his accent wasn't really strong, but it was strong enough for me. He's like, man, and I started talking to him, and he grew up in Laurinburg, which was in Scotland County. So it's the dialect is definitely a thing. And as the professor talked about there, what the origins of those are. Again, there's probably multiple influences, but it's a unique culture nonetheless, not just the culture itself, but again, actually the dialect that they use. And I even find myself, my wife gives me a hard time when I go home for a couple of days and I hang out with friends and family there, and I come back, you can sort of hear it. Okay.
Grammar.
Okay. Let's talk about Lumbee homecoming. If you want the quintessential sort of like pure Lumbee experience, Lumbee homecoming is what I would suggest. So Lumbee homecoming happens the week of July 4th every year. It's a sort of week-long event. It's basically a week-long celebration of Lumbee life, all things Lumbee. Events include powwow, Miss Lumbee, Little Miss Lumbee, and then that's a pageant style event. Those are often held. Many of these activities are held either at UNC Pembroke or just off campus inside of town there. Parade, car show, again, just a celebration of heritage and family. I've thought this, and my wife has made this comment before, that she thought it was weird that when we think about Native Americans, when we think about what European settlers did to Native culture, I mean, obviously it goes without saying that the negative impacts, but and so you would think, one might think that might impact how Native Americans feel about the United States as a whole, or the culture. But and I think I think this bears out for other tribes too. When you look at things like military enlistment among Native tribes, it's higher than what the general population is. And again, if you attend Lumbee homecoming, lots of United States flags, plenty of patriotism. So again, it's very much not just a celebration of the Lumbee people, but a celebration of the United States. And I think that I'm going to have some book recommendations at the end. If you read that, Lumbee people have, they take ownership in the United States and its heritage, and it's our culture as well as other folks, and we take pride in that. So and then here's just a couple of pictures from the powwow there. Okay, let's talk about identity. So again, I hope part of what I'm trying to do here is sort of challenge your ideas about what a Native American is, maybe what they look like. And this is these are images from, I have a link to this at the end, but if you Google you can just Google Washington Post Lumbee, and there was an article in 2018, I think, so it's been quite a few years, but the title of that article was "What Makes Someone Native American," and it just talks about a lot of what I'm talking about here, and these are all images of Lumbees. And again, I think that maybe when you take the skin tone away, they're just going to look like any other folks in the United States. But even speaking about skin tone and thinking about that too, that you're going to see a wide range of skin tones there. Everything from what, you would look at some folks and think they were white, and maybe even over to some folks who you might think are black too. So I think that, and all of these people are going to tell you they're Lumbee, and they're going to be proud about their heritage. Actually, this girl on the right here, I grew up with her. She was a few years older than me, drove the bus that I rode, but she grew up right around the corner. Lumbees have adopted a lot of Western. When we look at the Western tribes, I've had people ask about the regalia that Lumbees wear during powwows and things like that. Historically, we didn't have any of our own, any of our own garb or dress. So Lumbees have adopted a lot of what Western tribes use. But, in my mind, it doesn't make it any less authentic. It doesn't make it any less Lumbee. Okay. So if you're interested in more reading, sort of the seminal book at the moment is The Lumbee Indians and American Struggle. That was published in 2018. Melinda Maynor Lowry is her name. She is she's a Lumbee woman that was she was at UNC Chapel Hill up until maybe 3 years ago or so now. And I think she's down at, it escapes me. Yeah, she went to the school. It's in Georgia, but the name of the school escapes me. She's a Lumbee scholar who has written. She's done some documentaries in addition to writing this book. So that's the sort of seminal work if you want to know the sort of history of the Lumbees and get a good sense of the culture. That would be my recommendation. Nowhere else on earth. This is a fictional. I think this is a sort of fictional account of the Lumbee, so you can read that. Again, the pictures you saw, this what makes someone Native American, from the Washington Post in 2018, and then and again the only land I know that was written by Adolph Dow, 1975. That is it. So I got in under 50 minutes, so I'll pause now and see if anybody has any questions.